So we've talked about different types of currencies at various points. We've talked about Bitcoin, Monero, whatever. Now let's take it back all the way to the founding of the country. And what did the signers of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, say about money and anonymity and money? Lucas, you are largely going to be guiding this discussion, I bet. What even is this graphic we're looking at here? This is the Constitutional Convention.
This is the Constitutional Convention. I'm not sure actually who all the people are. Those who really get into this can name the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. But this is the likes of James Madison, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Oliver Ellsworth, who was called away back to Connecticut and did not end up signing it. Maybe he's not in this picture because this is the actual signing. But there were 55 delegates who were sent from the various colonies or the Confederate States under the Articles of Confederation, and the idea was that they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation. I don't know if you've ever looked at the Articles of Confederation, but it's only like one long page with 13. I think it's 13 different articles. So they were going to amend that. They ended up being they ended up taking months, all summer long, to come up with the document that we call the Constitution today. There's also an aside as we look at this picture. These are the framers. When you see a picture of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and those who would engage in the Revolutionary War, those were the founders. And there was a distinction made between the founders and the framers, certainly for many years, the first couple of generations of the United States, these United States. And the Constitutional Convention gets called after problems both with the defense of the United States, of the colonies, and also problems about taxation in the United States. And there was a rebellion that was called Shay's Rebellion that occurred in Pennsylvania. And there were Dutch Pennsylvania Dutch farmers who had fought in the Revolutionary War and who could not pay a tax that was assessed on them. I believe it was an income tax, and they were losing their farms. And they said, why did we, the people who fought the war against the British, now have to bow our necks to the laws of the Quakers? And Quakers were pacifists, many of the Quakers of New England did not fight in the Revolutionary War, but then turned around and had political positions and were spending money, spending money in the way the governments do, and passing the buck on down to the farmers and people who had actually fought in the Revolutionary War and fought for ideas that they thought were a little bit different than the yoke of all of these laws that were being passed down by the Quakers.
Yeah, and reading through this, it says they demanded payment in hard currency. And I think anytime we see that kind of language, that means like specie, right? Gold and silver, that they wouldn't take any other type of payment.
Absolutely. And that is also, I really want to get, often when we talk about money and we talk about the financial or the monetary history of the United States, we have this narrative of hard versus soft currency, and it is very important. But what we don't talk about, or often when we're
as opposed to barter, right? So they were saying, we want hard currency. You don't come in here with your chickens, because barter was pretty common too, right?
Well, barter is common, and not even so much barter, but think about like going to your general store, your local general store or local mercantile, or like a farm next to you that has a bunch of Jersey cows, and you're growing barley and wheat, and having a deal in which you say, well, whenever my crop is harvested in the fall, I will pay you then. Keep a running account, keep a note, a piece of paper with how much milk that I've bought from you, um, every week of every month of the year, and we'll settle out whenever my crop comes due.
Right, because there was no like regular income. People didn't have that. Money came in when you harvested your crop or when you slaughtered an animal or whatever, when you realized the thing that you had been allowed to keep living, because livestock and food that was in the ground, the plants that were in the ground, that was the real money. That's probably still the real money.
Yeah, I think it's certainly still the real money, and true commodities. Like, this is also why I think it's important to think in terms of gold and silver we call securities. There are other securities that we throw into that basket, but those are the things that rust or don't rust that much. And commodities, in my like greatest shorthand, are the things that rot. But commodities are so much important. Think about the difference of holding gold and silver and things that don't rust and that last for a long period of time in a warehouse, as opposed to holding grain. Like, that grain is going to be eaten by rats or gradually rot or just grow stale. And think about that in terms of, what if you had an apple farm or peach farm? You've got to be moving that crop and moving it into production. I mean, you can and you can process those crops to make other things out of them, but you're racing the clock. And so those are very different types of money, and and require sort of different accounting. I mean, even think about what we mean whenever we say accounting. You're telling a story about the value of an item. When you go to a bank, you go to a teller window. Why do you go to a teller window? Because that person is going to tell you a story about your value that that bank has assessed. And so if you think about telling a story about somebody's value or the value of a farm or of goods, commodities have a different story that needs to be told about them than securities. And the farmers understood that, even if they could not put that in words. But they're actually really good at putting that in words. If you go back and read, I mean, even newspapers up through the 1850s, whenever they're talking about the bimetallism and the monies of the United States. This is the oldest fight of the Union. But anyway, to bring it back, yes, the Shays Rebellion was what really prompted the Constitutional Convention and put into the minds of those delegates there, how are we going to make a a stronger union between these states? And what they settled on was the notion of both commerce and um, by writing into the Constitution liberty. And what they wrote in with regards to liberty had to do with debt and had to do with the movement of citizens. And notably, that did not apply to all. This is where the question of slavery comes in, and where the fugitive slave clause would be the huge bone of contention going forward, especially leading into the Civil War. But that notwithstanding, they understood that that the accounting and the money of the several states, the sovereign states, as they were very intentional in leaving the sovereignty of the states, would be questioned if there was a national banking system. And so it's interesting to look into the Constitution as to what they wrote down with regards to what the powers of the federal government were going to be and what the limitations. They both wrote powers of money, but not banking, into the Constitution, and they wrote limitations on the sovereign states with regards to what kind of banking they could engage in. So that's what I sort of wanted to look at today. And also with a note, again, not towards this notion of hardness or softness, because that will come I guess not necessarily later, but an issue that we focus on a lot. But if you think about what it means to create a, an economic or a commerce based system that binds all of these states together, um, in part you need a system in which there can be anonymity. So you can say cash out of Pennsylvania, where you have all these different accounts with varying people, with the mercantile, with the seamstress or the tailor, with the person who makes rye, the person who has an apple orchard, etc. So you can cash out of all of these book monies, these book accounting systems that you have, and you can convert that into something that you can put in your pocket and go to Ohio or go to Oregon or wherever it may be and start anew. And to do so requires anonymity. I mean, you think about what people needed to do. They needed to be able to sell all of those things, figure out what they owed, pay it all out, or settle up, and and go somewhere where they could also present coins, gold, and that would be gold or silver as enumerated by. Um, Actually, that's with regards to the states. Would where they could have some sort of coins where they could start again, and that brings us to the clauses of the Constitution. So we had an issue. We had an episode where we talked about the greenbacks of the currency that of the national banking system that Salmon P. Chase and Abraham Lincoln built in 1861 and 1862. But before then, there was this great question as to whether there could be a national bank, and part of that notion was that you would have coins. So, are we ready to maybe jump into? I hate to read things, but I think it's important to actually read like the clauses.
Section 8. You want to go to Section 8?
Yeah, let's go to Section 8.
All right.
Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which enumerates the powers, Congress's enumerated powers. So in Article 1, Section 8, we have these various enumerated powers.
Well,
And
the first thing that jumps out to me that you've told me before is this is one of the only offices that's written down in the Congress is post office. That's probably not germane to today, but I always find it interesting when I look at this particular clause.
well, it's it in a way it actually is germane because yes, when we think about the administrative state or bureaucracies that have grown under the executive office, because where does this bevy of bureaucracies come to us today? The DOJ, the EPA, well, not the USDA. Actually, is the USDA? Yeah, the USDA. So all of these, the DEA, the ATF, et cetera, all of those are created under the executive office. And how curious is that? And part of the complaint that you hear from Republicans or the right or other Americans, because this used to be a complaint of the left too, but one of the understandings of the problems of the federal government today is an abuse of its jurisdiction. Because if you actually go back to the Constitution and go back to the enumerated powers, you don't see, you're never going to find the Environmental Protection Agency listed in the Constitution. But what you do find is that it established the executive, it established Congress, and under Congress's enumerated powers, it talks about post offices, and it talked about that because it understood how essential. I mean, when we talk about the democracy today, they were very intentional not to have a democracy, but to be democratic, and they didn't see the democratic aspect of it as being one person, one vote. That was part of a movement towards it. But again, they were looking for the sovereignty of the states and ensuring liberty, the liberty of the citizens of those states to move from one state to the other, like the Schengen Agreement in Europe today. Um, and but as far as their concern for democracy or democratic, they thought it was very important, the freedom of speech, and not only that, the ability to communicate and to get your political ideas out. And
And that was done primarily what, through posting things into the newspapers and publishing of pamphlets, right? So that would have been.
Yes, pamphlets everywhere. So later we would see more newspapers, and um, I mean, Lincoln, I believe, imprisoned something like 3,000. What was there? 3,000 different publishing presses in New York at the time of the Civil War. But there was an absolute explosion of newspapers that would come later. But around the time of the Revolution, leading into it, pamphlets were the thing. Like, write down your ideas, sort of like people do all over the internet today. You write down your ideas, but how are you going to get that out whenever you can't just put it up on a blog? Well, this is where the post office came in. And have you ever heard of franking privileges?
Vaguely, but tell me what franking is again.
Franking privileges are given to members of Congress, senators, and representatives. And what that means is they don't have to pay to post things to the mail. And so they don't have to pay to use the post offices or the postal roads. And that's called a franking privilege. And the idea there was, well, if you actually are elected, then you should not have to bear the burden of disseminating your message. In some ways, like so many legislatures that we see today talk about when they talk about like being elected as if it's a job, I think that is contrary to the interests of the people of the United States, because it shouldn't be a job, especially whenever we've given them the power of creating money. They get to decide what to pay themselves and what retirement plans they can give themselves. They have their own retirement plan that none of us are on. But really, if you go back and look at the Constitution, and the franking privilege is part of what they should be doing, is communicating the agreements and the problems of the United States back to their constituency. And so not only does the post work, or the post office work in regards to like campaigning for an election, but we should see, once you're an elected official, you get to mail all your constituents for free. And instead of seeing a lot of members of Congress like engaging with their constituency and talking about what's going on in Washington, what I see most of the time are both like raising money, but also complaining about and like this whole narrative of, I'm going to go to Washington and I'm going to drain the swamp. Anyway, so yes, the in the enumerated powers there is the post office, and I think like also the issue of the post office is not germane to the question of banks, because when you look at the arguments that come about the establishment of post offices and postal roads question, part of the argument that comes after the signing of the Constitution by the several states is what does that actually mean? Can the federal government own property in a sovereign state? They certainly can't own land. Could they actually own property? The states own the land. What does that mean? Can they charter a road? Does it merely need to be guaranteed? And so if you think about that contention over post offices, or the concept of a mail system, and you notice that they actually established that post office. It's really interesting that somehow banks make their way through. Because if you read through the enumerated powers, you'll notice there's nothing with regards to the establishment of a national banking system, or even like listen to us say the establishment of a national banking system. Whenever a bank is a building a place to secure specie and for people to go and withdraw banknotes, or to deposit their species. So quite interesting that doesn't make it into the enumerated powers. And the question we might ask then was, where does Alexander Hamilton argue for the establishment of a national bank? By the way, Alexander Hamilton was one of the framers, or the framer who most championed a national bank. And Thomas Jefferson was sort of the leader of the faction against it, the Republican faction, and the Federalist faction was that who was for the national bank. And Alexander Hamilton argues for the establishment of a national banking system under the necessary and proper clause, which if you look, it says the Congress may make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out into execution the foregoing powers. And one of those foregoing powers being clauses 5 and 6, which said that the Congress shall have the power to coin money, to regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and to fix the standard of weights and measures, and also to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities of the current coin of the United States. So I think that's very interesting that there.
And this counterfeiting, this counterfeiting would have been what, like making fake coinage, right? That's really what this is referring
Well,
to.
this is where you get debasement, coin base. Where do we get some of these words that we throw around in the crypto sphere today? The debasement of currency. Where do the bars of the dollar sign come from today? The bars come from, if you pull out a quarter and look at the edge of a quarter, you'll notice that there are ridges around the edge. And so there were different ways of debasing coins. And even if you look at English coins, you'll see that a quarter pence and a half pence like a half pence is literally cut in half, so it looks like a half moon. But a quarter pence has a hole drilled out of it, so you have you have a much tinier coin that was literally just drilled by people after it was minted by the king, or by the treasury of the king. People would they needed smaller fractions of exchange, and so they made them themselves. So part of the idea in the the other things that you could do, and so you'll see disagreements later in the United States over who owns the mints, especially whenever gold and silver are found in the Western lands. So in Colorado, the Denver Mint that we see in Denver today is there because the federal government found it expedient. They had an issue with there being private mints, and so so they made sure to control the mints of coins in the United States. And because the other things you could do when you melt metal down, we have all sorts of jewelry today that are amalgamations of metal, and even, I mean, if you put a penny in, I think Coca-Cola, and leave it there for a while, the acidity of the Coke will eat away the metal in a penny, and pennies today, we at one time had a lot of copper in them. Now they're mainly zinc and other cheap metals. And
Yeah, I think 1983 is the cutoff for when the pennies stopped being pure copper.
really well, and we also know that what was it, something somewhere around 1964, we stopped having silver in coins. Um, and we call the nickel today because it was originally made of nickel, and that nickel was of a value according to what the value of the metal in the coin was. And so we also had we had we had coins that were stamped of um, of gold and silver. So gold and silver are sort of the chief, or the parents of this coin system. But obviously we can use all copper, nickel, and other metals. But when you stamp a coin, and also stamp is another interesting word. To stamp, to stomp. We've talked about chomping at the bit. Is it champing at the bit or chomping at the bit? Well, do you stamp a coin or do you stomp on somebody's hand? Interestingly enough, they're the same word. And another form of money is to print stamps. I mean, the Revolutionary War is in response to the Stamp Act. And why is the Stamp Act? Because the government is putting a piece of paper on goods to assess a tax on them, and taxing in that way is another type of money. But so that's where we get the verb to stamp coins, and to stamp paper, and why they're related, because they're both from the treasury of the government. So anyway, when we're creating coins, if you think about what is special about coins, going back to this notion of setting out a system where people could move about the United States, or move about the world, part of that is enabled by this concept of coins. And what do coins have apart? They have standard weights and measures of the metals that are in them, and a guarantee by the government as to what is put into them. But there's also this notion of anonymity, and the conquistadors who came to the Aztec and the Incan empires were taking back on boats to Spain, not coins, but religious statues, and things that were singular and how they looked. And what did they do to them? They melted them down, and they turned them into, I won't say faceless, because they often had the face of the sovereign on them, but ubiquitous fungible tokens. And what was special about those ubiquitous fungible tokens? Well, whenever you make when you get away from this notion of an artifact, or a special a special statue, or I can't come up with the word, but you get the idea. When you have this notion of singularity in what you have created out of gold and silver, it's very different to go to a coin. And what these coins bring is an anonymity. So, are you following me here?
I think so. The jump to anonymity is a little. I'm not sure I 100% got that. So maybe we need to go into that just for a second, because I was following along with the debasement, the counterfeiting the coin, and all that. But then when we jumped to anonymity, you lost me.
Well, so we should go further back into maybe coins, and the word money comes to us from the Romans, and the Romans were making money. Going back to the discussion earlier about what money looks like whenever it's based off of commodities. There's this, if some of the players have to wait for a full year for the fruition, listen to that word, fruition, fruits, for the fruition of their harvest, then you have then people are both bound to the land, bound to the place for the production of that money, and bound to the accounts. So whenever you start making money, or we think of money in terms of coins, part of what part of what is necessary for the transfer of value is is to have something that you can pass from hand to hand, that can leave the vestiges of the, the associations with who owns something that's written down in a book. And so you need something that's a token, or that can be anonymous, that's not tied to the history of the holder. Is that making more sense?
So would there have been other instruments that were tied in such a way?
Hmm. Um,
I guess it just makes me think, it's like as you're bringing up this concept of anonymity, like, and where does it exist and how does this come into play, right? It just as somebody not as well versed in how the systems actually functioned, and when you start saying, well, it has to have this property, it just makes me wonder if it was like a movement against things which didn't have these particular properties, or if it was just, well, it needs to be this way, and this is why we're still doing, gold and silver coins or whatever.
well, I think actually a great question. I had to think for a second, but you know, think about what does banking in Switzerland bring to us? What does using proton mail, which was started in Switzerland. I'm not sure where it is at now, but what do they bring to us?
Well, anonymity, I suppose, and untraceability, and the expectation that somebody can't look into what you're doing from a financial perspective. That was the thing that always was what I thought that people were getting out of banking there. A Swiss bank account, it was always referred to that way.
Absolutely, Swiss banking was founded not because there were gold mines in Switzerland, but because they promised to keep the secrets of the landowners from the lower lands of Europe. And and even if you think about what the United States did in the wake of 9/11 and going out and looking at the various banking systems all around the world, what did they want to do but to look at everyone's books so that they could track and look at where money was being moved around throughout the world. And 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 here, I think, whenever we get back to the Constitution and we think about the powers that were enumerated, and those powers that were not given to them, I think that it's important to think about the anonymity of coins, and to ask ourselves whether it was a good idea to give the federal government the power to do so. Um, and especially, I mean, now that we live in a world where we've given the federal government the power to control a national banking system, and not only that, but to foist upon the rest of the world the use of that banking system, and then to turn around and to take away the anonymity of the world. I think that sets up for us the problems that we see in in the abuse of the United States power throughout the world today. So, this is so often when we talk about the the prohibition, or the subtle prohibition, or the lack of the lack it's hard to phrase this, the lack of the enumeration of a banking power given to the federal government. We do so with regards to the discussion about the propensity of state banks to start to lie or to debase their currency. But the other thing that is so important to look at when we think about why they did not have a banking power is to think about the the intent of the Constitution to enshrine liberty. and again, think back to Shay's rebellion and this idea of bringing together sovereign states and how they were to be bound together, to be bound through a commerce system. Well, if you're going to be bound through a commerce system, you need a way to forgive debts, and you need a way for people to move about. And so, does the are the enumerated are do the enumerated powers include debt forgiveness? Well, um, absolutely. That it and with coupled with that debt forgiveness, bankruptcy is also naturalization. Like who gets to be considered a citizen in which states, and do they get a chance to start over? And so I think that's a much those are much more important aspects of of the what the monetary systems of the states, or private monetary systems in the states were to look like, as opposed to what the national system grew to be. Um, so um, I don't know, and I think as we we've lived in a system in which a national banking system did emerge. And so it did emerge again under the necessary and proper clause. Almost immediately after the signing of the Constitution, we get national banks by Alexander Hamilton, one of the leader of the Federalist Party, and we all know Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson.
And that was hugely contentious of this whole idea of founding the bank. To my recollection, that this was not something that had popular support. He had to fight pretty hard to get that through.
Fought incredibly hard. This is also, Maryland versus McCulloch is one of the most important decisions of the Supreme Court. It was decided in 1819 under the John Marshall Court. Are you familiar with, to my mind, the most famous quote of John Marshall, which was, "The power to tax is the power to destroy."
I think it's one of the most famous, and yeah, I mean that one gets bandied about quite a bit, along with all taxation is theft. Yes, pretty familiar with that one.
Well, and this, again, Maryland is such a very interesting state too, because you think also to the religious alliances of the various states, and Maryland was a Catholic state amongst many other Protestant states. So why did Quebec not sign the Constitution and join the several states? Well, because they were Catholic, and they thought, there's a lot of Protestant notions here. How are we all going to get along? So they stayed out of joining this union of this commercial union, and lead the nation of Canada today. But McCulloch versus Maryland was after Hamilton's national bank was established. Maryland was very much against it, and so what did they do? They said, well, if a national banking system is to exist in our sovereign states, they have to use our buildings and our materials, and we can tax those. But the problem with taxing a building or the use of those materials is we only get to do that once. But they use paper every day. If you're in a bank, you must be using paper all the time. Well, you have to use the state paper, and to show that you're using the state paper, it must be stamped. And so they passed a law that said the national bank had to use their stamped paper, and that there would be a tax on that stamped paper, or that it cost to have it stamped. And then whenever the national bank said, well, we're not going to pay to use your paper, we'll bring our own in, they said, you can't. And not only that, but we're going to assess a massive fine because you're not using our paper. And this became the fight which brought the matter before the Supreme Court, and was the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. And John Marshall said, we can't have that. the United States federal banking system is protected under the necessary and proper clause, and so for uh,
And this is a good example of where we say the judiciary is inherently political, right? I mean, we clearly have something that's political in nature being decided here.
oh, 100%. And this is also why I think it's so important to go back. You know, who was the Supreme Court justice before John Marshall? Oliver Ellsworth. What does the Constitution say about the judiciary? Well, it certainly does not. Uh, One, it says that there will be federal tribunals versus trials, and does the it's the it's the Judiciary Act of 1789 that is enacted by Congress, who, again, the Judiciary Act was written by Oliver Ellsworth, senator from, I believe, Connecticut, maybe Massachusetts, but I think Connecticut. But written by Oliver Ellsworth, establishes our judicial system. And I find it so very curious that the reliance on juries to be a check against the political power of both of legislatures and judges, that we see that we see dictated that the states must use for their court systems is not carried over to the federal system. And I think that I think that if we are to fix some of the political excesses and the abuses of the judicial system, quote unquote lawfare, then I think that we need to go back to the Constitution, back to the Judiciary Act of 1789, and rethink how this would have best worked out. Because John Marshall the John Marshall Court in 1819 made a very political decision. And they weren't just calling balls and strikes whenever they decided that the Constitution implied the power to create a national banking system. I mean, listen to all.
And that's the famous quote about like the impartiality of the judicial, which we've at various points definitely called into question and said that this is 100% not the case. They're not calling balls and strikes. They're absolutely participating in the political process and making judgments that have to do with the political winds of whoever puts them into those seats.
Absolutely not. It's so political. To my mind, it is the most political. And when we talk about the democratic the democratic ideals, and but also avoiding the traps of democracy, those democratic ideals need to be embodied in the justice system. And you don't if you're going to give voice to everyday citizens, then we need to think about how everyday citizens represent themselves in the justice system, and it's through a jury, not through judges. Um, and again, I think that the the powers that are given to Congress too are with regards to or one of the greatest powers is with regards to bankruptcies and naturalization. Um, and we have given away those powers of Congress to the judiciary, and so often the federal government needs to go back to um, not just a money that is both like in circulation, because when we talk about the gold standard too, it's part of that discussion is watered down with an equation of being on gold as being the same as on a gold standard, because it's it's one thing to have a banking system that is tied to things that exist in the real world and are being passed around and able to be held by the various citizens or the various states. But think of what a great change it was whenever the federal government forbade the citizens of the states to use the things that it was using to back the notes that it was passing around in that national banking system. And so being on gold simultaneous as being with with a banking system that's on a gold standard is one thing, but to deny all the people the ability to hold um, the commodities and the securities that banknotes are passed around on is an even greater power that is transferred from people into the government, and that can become a problem. And then you think about what has happened with regards to debt forgiveness and expectations as to whether a debt is the fault um, of the lender or the the lender or the creditor. We've seen massive changes in those, and we live in a world today where we have these problems with corporations. And then think into the future too, post Civil War, about some of the solutions that are put forth by the liberals and the progressive movements, both in the Republican Party, um, and those solutions that seem to just revolve around us today. What are some of the changes that were accepted? They were what was accepted was that a debt was the fault of the creditor, not the lender. And and if you think back to the anonymity and the bankruptcy that protections that are written into the Constitution, I think that there would have been an understanding, much more so, that a debt was more so the fault of the lender than the creditor. Is that making any sense?
I'm following along. These are perspectives that, I mean, certainly aren't reflected today. So it's interesting to hear you talk about the way that these things were considered in times past, and I think it's interesting also to see that there was bankruptcy stuff that was written into the Constitution, just how foremost in the mind of the framers that these concepts were and how important they were. That, like, falling into destructive debt wasn't the end of your life, which I think in some ways in other countries in Britain, when they had these debtors prisons and whatever, that it kind of was the end of your life if you were to fall into certain types of dire straits.
Well, and this is also why I think it's interesting to remember too that freedom is a notion with regards to both what is the tax assessed to somebody. If freedom literally goes back to the words Freya and doom. What does your mother record? Freya is the Norse mother god. Does your mother forgive your debts? Yes. Does your mother give you better tax rates or charge you less for living in her home? Uh, I mean, maybe not everybody's mother, but most of them would. Um, and so this notion of the liberty, notions of liberty and freedom are are foundational for the identity of America and for the American system. But whenever we equate them, it's part of a shift in understanding. Again, is the fault of a debt, does it go to the lender or the creditor? And if it goes to the creditor, how are we um, ruining this notion of both liberty and freedom? Because we wind up in a system of debt slavery, which is the feudal system people were fleeing from from the feudal Europe. So as we move into a world where we begin to think about alternatives that crypto brings to us, about CBDCs, um, it's one thing to think about the government being able to track what your social credit is, et cetera, et cetera. we should not be stopping the conversation about the government's the government's powers with regards to banking there. We should be going back to saying, what is our understanding of debt forgiveness, and whose fault, whose shoulders the fault of a debt lies on? Because, and this is also in part the discussion with, say, student debt today. But it's neither is it the power of the executive to assert that authority, because the forgiveness of debts is the to me one of the greatest authorities that we can give to a legislative body. And so it should be a conversation that is picked up by Congress and by the states. So, and we haven't talked either, not only does the Constitution enumerate powers for Congress, it also in, I believe, Section 10, Article 1, Section 10, include prohibitions for the state governments. And it denies the state governments it explicitly denies the state governments the power to create a banking system. And they could charter banks, but I think whenever you look at both the enumerated powers of Congress at the federal level and what powers were denied to banks at the state level, it also was an understanding that there should be many private private monetary systems, private banking systems that gave people a choice as to which ones that they were going to use. And not only in that, it also forbids the states it forbids states from interfering with the obligation of contract, and that clause. Have you ever heard of the contract clause? Is that one familiar to you?
No, should I pull it up?
Yeah, go ahead and pull it up, because if you start digging into the contract clause, I have a massive book that I inherited, and would peek through when I was a child, a legal, I don't know, a constitutional and Supreme Court decisions. But when we get to the contract clause, I think this is like from the early 80s, whatever. It said like the contract clause has led to 40% of the cases considered by the Supreme Court of the United States, and so it is a very interesting clause logically to think about. Like, what does it mean for the federal government to bar a sovereign state from interfering or impairing the obligation of a contract? And a contract, by the way, is not something that's written down on a piece of paper. That is just a record of a contract. A contract is an agreement in the minds between two parties. And so, and also, if you want to get into the politicization of the judicial system, digging into decisions that have been made about what does it mean to impair the obligation of a contract, will confuse anyone. But I think, like, at the broadest level, what it does mean is that it was to be the province of the private sector, or for people to enter into their own monetary systems, whether that be agreements with their neighbors, agreements with a business on Main Street, or a church, and it was neither the place of the federal government or the state's governments to interfere with that. So, any questions? We're rolling in on the end of the hour, and I know it's been a sort of an obtuse topic to throw on the table today, but
well, given all the background and the discussion that we had, would you say that there's a a summarization of what we put in the title. Like, we need anonymity of money, and I think everybody kind of understands that there's some general need for this. But when we look at the Constitution, we look at the founders and the framers, and we look for the evidences of where these things come into play. We see, these discussions about coining money, about bankruptcy, about private contracts. So, but we don't see the word anonymity. So was that like a word that was actually thought of and like part of their lexicon, or did that come later and really it wasn't something that was particularly thought of in the way that we would think of the word anonymous or anonymity? Because that to me kind of means without a name, anonymous. Like it means like sans name, like no name.
Um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where the word anonymous comes in, but what I think is just incredibly important to think about in terms of if what the powers of the federal government are, especially as we move into a world with very powerful technological solutions. I mean, it's one thing to have coins that we can put in our pocket, and that it's hard for government officials to go out and physically track. What amount of autonomy did we give away whenever we moved to banknotes that had serial numbers? Uh, what sort of shifting of the Overton window of norms have we seen in granting the government or granting our expectations of what the government can do in tracking that? I mean, when we think about what the government does with sanctions to the various countries of the world, if we understood the limitations of a coinage system or the intents as to what coinage means, is I don't think that that is congruent with the abuse with the powers that the federal government has assumed with that monetary or international banking system that we have today. And as we see, like, how I mean, I guess part of what makes me think about this today is when the United States stopped honoring anonymity and the dollars that it gave to the various countries of the world, when it started sanctioning the bank accounts, abusing the SWIFT system to turn off people's money or to turn off countries' money, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, etc., etc. It didn't mean that, or it has not meant that they have been forever under our thumb. What it means is that they have created their own systems, and and there will be a point. Well, you might even say, like, what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is an alternative monetary system that even citizens of the United States can use. And so, if we're to understand some of the early, like, foundational principles of money, then we need to understand that providing anonymity is as important as providing soundness. The Constitution doesn't talk about sound or unsound money, but we all understand, and politicians certainly of the time understood, what inflation meant, and that it wasn't just the price inflation that we were put today, but the actual inflation of the number of coins or the value of coins. And 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 whether it be in banknotes and the basket of securities and commodities that back a banknote, or debts that back a banknote, um, they under they that was nothing new. Like, the inflation that we see today, that exists in the national banking system, the dollar banking system that we see today, is nothing new. So I
I
I
think that's one of the most important points. One of the most important takeaways is that this just isn't new, and I think we make too much about this 1970 Nixon shock. This idea that we switched over to something, and this is recent. Like these things have been happening for a long time. They're retreads of old concepts that keep coming up. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to it. But yeah, great discussion, Lucas. Love the historical perspective on this, and yeah, I think we're done for the hour today. But thanks so much for kind of leading us through this discussion and this topic, and maybe we'll have to follow it up with a why do we need anonymity in money, and here it is for today's day and age, and let's couch it in terms of crypto and Monero and whatever else, because we're definitely coming around to this same topic once again.
It's funny that you mentioned Monero, because part of even why I wanted to have this discussion was the chain analysis, and the node situation going on Monero, and just sort of also the curious nature of blockchain with its how hard it is to use digital network solutions to create and enshrine privacy. So yeah, we'll pick more of the conversation up. Thank you for entertaining my old historical concern about anonymity and money. So, and maybe we'll also at some point we can do a conversation about the contract clause, but that'll have to be a whole episode. So anyway, I enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.
All right, we'll see you tomorrow.